Hello, everybody. It gives me huge pleasure tonight to introduce Dr Martin Pickard, conductor and repetiteur with Opera North, to deliver tonight's insight lecture, We Have Heard the Chimes at Midnight, Verdi, Falstaff and Time. This lecture is one of many activities taking place through the auspices of a new 3-year collaboration between Opera North and Newcastle University, which was launched in May this year, with the ambition to transform performance practice and audience accessibility through an exchange of knowledge between academic researchers and the operatic stage. The partnership builds on the two organisations' history of working together around Opera North's regular tours to Newcastle and Gateshead, which this week, of course, sees a production of Falstaff at the Theatre Royal, Newcastle, amongst other shows. The aims for the project are for an all-embracing exploration of the voice on the stage, from questions of vocal health to those of representation of both marginalised and silenced voices. So now to introduce tonight's speaker. Dr Martin Pickard is a conductor and repetiteur at Opera North, and he was the company's head of music from 2008 to 2015. After studying at Cambridge University and the Royal College of Music, he began his operatic career in Germany, working at the opera houses of Kiel and Nuremberg. In 1989, he joined Opera North, and he has conducted many productions for the company, including The Marriage of Figaro, Macbeth, Rigoletto, Carmen, Boris Godunov, Eugene Onegin, La Bohème, Madame Butterfly, Der Rosenkavalier, A Midsummer Night's Dream, and Peter Grimes. Beyond Opera North, he has worked with English National Opera, Opera Les Azurials, the Bregenzer Festspiele, Buxton Festival, Perth International Festival in Western Australia, the Matav Symphony Orchestra of Budapest, and the Tiroler Landestheater of Innsbruck. In 2003, he assisted Jerzy Belavelek on the landmark Glyndebourne production of Tristan und Isolde, and since then he has returned to Glyndebourne regularly as a member of the festival's music staff. In 2005, he made his Glyndebourne conducting debut with The Bartered Bride. And since 2018, he has been closely involved in the London Philharmonic Orchestra's Ring Cycle project, acting as repetiteur and assistant conductor to Vladimir Jurovsky. Beyond opera, he is active as a piano accompanist, appearing amongst others with the tenor Ilka Akayarek, the mezzo-soprano Catherine Wynne-Rogers, and the soprano Leslie Garrett. He lectures on opera at the University of Leeds, where he also holds a PhD in the history of German Romantic opera. With that introduction done, I'd like to welcome Martin to the stage. I'm sure you are going to very much enjoy the next 3/4 of an hour. Thank you, Martin.
Thank you very much, Jo. My immediate connection with Falstaff is that I've been working on the Opera North production, which arrived in Newcastle this week as part of our sustainable season of 3 operas. So I've been very much immersed in this piece for the last 3 or 4 months, really. And at one point, while we were rehearsing Falstaff this autumn, some colleagues and I took time out to watch the Orson Welles Falstaff film, Chimes at Midnight. And if you don't know that film, I would recommend it very highly. It is an absolutely terrific film. Orson Welles took his title, and I've taken mine, from this conversation in Shakespeare's Henry IV, Part 2. So Falstaff and his old friend Shallow are reminiscing about their wild youth in the company of Shallow's colleague Silence. Ah, cousin Silence, that thou hadst seen that this night and I have seen. Ha, Sir John, said I well? We have heard the chimes at midnight, Master Shallow. That we have that we have, that we have. In faith, Sir John, we have. Now, Orson Welles includes that conversation in the very first scene of his film. And while it doesn't directly find its way into Verdi's opera, for me, it encapsulates certain things that are very present in the opera, and which I'd like to talk about today. Firstly, although Verdi's opera takes the plot of The Merry Wives of Windsor as its basis, its Falstaff is not just the Falstaff of The Merry Wives of Windsor. He is also this Falstaff, the Falstaff of the Henry IV plays. And I hope to show you what I mean by that. Secondly, and related to that first point, the opera, as in this scene, deals in themes of reminiscence, of nostalgia, and of an awareness of the passing of time, themes that are also absent from The Merry Wives of Windsor. So I'll try to illustrate that. And thirdly, the more I lived with this opera over the last few months, the more I felt that Verdi was not just using the passing of time as a dramatic theme, he was also experimenting in very interesting ways with actual time, with musical time. And a key illustration of that, which I'll show you later, is the moment in the opera where we hear a clock striking midnight. But before we go into that, let me just quickly put Falstaff the opera into some context. It was Verdi's last opera, written at the end of a long career which had spanned more than half a century. Verdi, if you look at the dates there, born 1813, so Verdi was in his late 70s when he composed it, and that premiere in 1893 happened in his 80th year. Despite that long career, and so you don't have to count them, I'll tell you there are 26 operas on that page, and I haven't even included the operas that he revisited and revised and reissued in a different language or anything. It was effectively his first comic opera. There had been one right at the start, you see highlighted in red there, called Un giorno di regno, but that had flopped badly, and Verdi had never shown any inclination to revisit it or revive it since. It was also his third opera based on Shakespeare, a writer who had fascinated him all his life. So we have in 1847, we have Macbeth. In 1887, we have Othello, based on Othello. And now in 1893, we have Falstaff, based on The Merry Wives of Windsor. Now, The Merry Wives of Windsor, just quickly for those unfamiliar with it, it concerns the fat knight Sir John Falstaff, who's down on his luck and living in the town of Windsor. He writes two identical love letters to Mrs. Ford and Mrs. Page, two rich wives of the town, hoping to seduce them and gain access to their money. But they spot the trick, and as punishment, they turn the tables and trick Falstaff into a series of humiliations. There's also a subplot concerning the marriage of Mrs. Page's daughter Anne, and a series of minor characters, including a comedy French doctor, Dr Caius, and a comedy Welsh parson, the Reverend Hugh Evans. It's traditionally been regarded as one of Shakespeare's weaker plays, possibly written in a hurry. And when I was doing my background reading, I found this. This is W.H. Auden's Lectures on Shakespeare, which he gave in the 1940s at a college in New York. When he was teaching this course, Auden would generally devote one whole lecture to the major plays. So in here, Julius Caesar takes up about 13 pages. As You Like It takes up about 14 pages. The one notable exception is The Merry Wives of Windsor, for which Auden's lecture, if you can see it, the entire lecture looks like this on. So just 4 sentences, which I'll read to you. The Merry Wives of Windsor is a very dull play indeed. We can be grateful for its having been written because it provided the occasion of Verdi's Falstaff, a very great operatic masterpiece. Mr. Page, Shallow, Slender, and the host disappear. I have nothing to say about Shakespeare's play, so let's hear Verdi. After which, Auden spent the rest of the lecture playing the students a recording of the opera. So what Auden was pointing to here is that while Verdi and his librettist, Arrigo Boito, based the overall action of the opera on The Merry Wives of Windsor, within that framework, they made big changes. Firstly, they simplified the action. They shortened the story, and they got rid of quite a lot of characters. Auden mentions Mr. Page, Shallow, Slender, and the host. In fact, half a dozen other characters also ended up on the cutting room floor, reducing Shakespeare's cast list of 20 to just 10. That's fairly standard practice when you turn a play into an opera. You slim it down. Amongst other reasons, it avoids an overly long evening in the theatre because sung text takes so much longer to deliver than spoken text. But Auden is also acknowledging something else. In order to characterize their opera Falstaff more fully than the rather shallow farcical Falstaff we meet in The Merry Wives, Boito and Verdi, who both knew their Shakespeare very well, imported significant amounts of material from the two other plays in which Falstaff appears, Henry IV Part 1 and Henry IV Part 2. The Merry Wives of Windsor is generally assumed to have been written later than those two plays, so Shakespeare's first night audience would probably have arrived at the theatre with the advantage of a preconceived idea of the Falstaff character based on the one they had seen in those history plays. But if we read The Merry Wives in isolation, although it is nominally set in the same period as the Henry IV plays, and some characters appear in both, it actually feels like something that is playing out in Shakespeare's own time, 200 years later. In fact, the plot has so little to do with any specific historical moment that at least one modern scholar has compared it to science fiction. In an essay entitled Shakespeare's Quantum Physics, Kay Stanton of California State University has written, "Is Merry Wives Falstaff the same Falstaff of those history plays or a completely different character? My answer borrows and modifies a line from Shakespeare's Troilus and Cressida. This is and is not Falstaff. He is the Falstaff of the Henriade, but transported into the parallel universe of the Merry Wives of Windsor." Now, I think Stanton is having a bit of fun there, but she's also onto something, and modern productions have found it relatively easy to time travel with both the play and the opera. So here is Bill Alexander's 1985 Royal Shakespeare Company production, which set it in the 1950s. Here's Robert Carson's 2012 production of the opera, the Royal Opera House Covent Garden, which set it in a similar period. And here's an image from the current Opera North production, which sets the piece in the 1980s. Alongside this, and irrespective of the period in which he's placed by a production, the Falstaff of the Merry Wives of Windsor seems to live entirely in his own present. His concerns are simply where the next bit of money or the next drink is going to come from, whether the next seduction is going to work, whether he can get out of the latest scrape. One achievement of the opera's borrowings from the Henry IV plays is they give Falstaff back his own backstory, a personal past that he never mentions in The Merry Wives of Windsor. This can be quite a subtle process. So, for example, in the play, when Falstaff is back at the Garter Inn, recovering from having been thrown into the Thames in a laundry basket, he has this soliloquy. "Have I lived to be carried in a basket like a barrow of butcher's offal and be thrown into the Thames? The rogues slighted me into the river with as little remorse as they would have drowned a blind bitch's puppies." Now, Boito and Verdi take that soliloquy and expand that phrase, "have I lived," significantly. So, on a quick translation, "Then I will have lived so many years as a brave and dexterous knight, audace destro cavaliere, per essere portato in canestro e gittato al canale Comarlini," to be carried in a basket and thrown into the canal with dirty nappies, I think that means, as one does with cats and blind kittens. So the bit I've highlighted there, in a sense, is what, I mean, the imagery is slightly different, but essentially, for me, the most significant thing is that they've added something in there about Falstaff's perception of himself and who he was in the past before he met these current humiliations. Another example of Boito and Verdi making the opera Falstaff refer to his past comes in the middle of his attempted seduction of Alice Ford. When she makes a reference to his bulk, he sings a little song about the slim young boy that he used to be. Now, there's no such song in The Merry Wives of Windsor. The words Falstaff sings are probably inspired by two separate passages in the Henry IV play. So this is Falstaff in Henry IV, Part 1, saying, "When I was about thy years, Hal," he's talking to Prince Hal, "I was not an eagle's talon in the waist. I could have crept into an alderman's thumb ring." And then there's a line from Shallow, which is actually from that same scene that I quoted at the beginning. "Then was Jack Falstaff, now Sir John, a boy, and page to Thomas Mowbray, Duke of Norfolk." So out of these, Boito and Verdi created a little moment of reminiscence. And I'll sing it to you. I should just say, in order not to spend a lot of time translating Italian to English, some of these examples I'm going to sing to you or present to you are going to be in the very witty English translation by Amanda Holden, which is the one that we are using at Opera North. So this is Falstaff. "When I was page to the noble Duke of York, I was so tender, so tender, so tender. I was a vision, a mirage, a spirit so slender, so slender, so slender. Those were the days of merriment and splendor. Those were the days I happily remember. I was so quick and so supple and nimble that I could have hidden myself in a thimble," etc., etc. Now, I said that kind of recreation of Falstaff's past is done by Boito and Verdi, and the point I'm making is it's not just the words but the music that are recreating that. Taken out of context here, it's slightly hard to convey how strikingly different that music is from the rest of Falstaff's role, and indeed from what he's just been singing. I mean, just before that, he's been in classic romantic baritone, "I love you," this kind of thing, great leaps in the voice and so on. And suddenly we get to that "when I was page," and the direction for the singer is leggerissimo, as light as possible. The large orchestra is reduced to strings marked PPP, and the tune, dum da da dum da da dee da da dee, it kind of tiptoes along in little steps. It's a tune that could be sung by a child. And it's as if this very large man we see on the stage is genuinely reliving his past, channeling his younger, slimmer self. At other points in the opera, it's specifically Verdi's music that gives a sense of the past. In these cases, it's a more general, shared past, a feeling that behind the bustling modernity of this Windsor, there are traditions, older, long-standing ways of doing things. So when Dr. Caius storms out of the Garter Inn, saying he will find other drinking companions, ones who are honest, sober, civil, and pious, Bardolph and Pistol, the two rascals, pick up on his last adjective, pious, and sarcastically sing Amen in a consciously archaic musical style, a kind of bad Palestrina.
You wish to drink with Dr. Caius. I swear you must be honest, sober, well-bred, and pious. Spare me the counterpoint, that awful intertwining.
And then later, when Ford blesses the betrothal of his daughter to Dr. Caius, or that's what he thinks is happening, the music evokes a kind of old-style formality. We hear a minuet.
Now the bride is approaching with her bridegroom. How charming! How charming! Look at her, a crown of roses surrounds the veil which hides her radiant beauty. Ready beside her bridegroom, he whom I have chosen, gather round the new fair.
You probably recognize the kind of archetypal minuet rhythm in a slow 3. Just going back, we'll get to that later. So like Falstaff's songs, these references to older musical styles. So from the late 19th century, we're talking about a style in terms of the kind of palestrina that's already 400 years old, in terms of the minuet that's at least kind of 100 years old. They stand out from the rest of Verdi's score, which is written in that idiom of the late 19th century. So they're in quotation marks, and those quotation marks are designed to be noticed. But spending time with this piece in the rehearsal room, I came to feel that there were other, less obvious ways in which Verdi was dealing with the concept of time. Now, one should be cautious about reading too much of a composer's biography into his work, but as we saw, Verdi was an old man when he came to write Falstaff, and he was conscious of the fact that time might be running out. Early in the collaboration, he wrote to Boito, who was nearly 30 years younger than him, in outlining Falstaff, did you never think of the enormous number of my years, supposing I couldn't stand the strain and failed to finish it? You would then have wasted your time and trouble to no purpose. The Falstaff of the opera frequently compares his former young self with his present old self, contemplating the differences made by the passing of time. We saw that in that little song and in Boito's addition to Falstaff's soliloquy. Elsewhere, the opera Falstaff sees himself as the last embodiment of a great age that is passing. So, I'll do a quick translation of this. Mondo reo, evil world, non c'è virtù, there is no virtue, tutto declina, everything is in decline. Va, vecchio John, va per la tua vita. Go, old John, go through your life. Cammina finché tu muoia. Allor scomparirà la vera virilità dal mondo. So, walk on until you die. Cammina finché tu muoia. Allor scomparirà la vera virilità dal mondo. And then true manliness, true virility will disappear from the world. So he sees himself really as the last of the great heroes. At another point in the opera, that idea of the passing of time is made absolutely literal and concrete. In the last act of The Merry Wives of Windsor, Falstaff has been told that if he wants another assignation with Alice, he must come at midnight to Herne's oak tree in the middle of Windsor Forest. He arrives in the forest and tells us, the audience, that, and I quote, the Windsor bell hath struck 12. In the opera, Boito and Verdi go one stage further. We hear that clock striking in real time, and Verdi frames the moment in a very interesting way. Now, striking clocks are nothing new in Verdi operas. There's a very good example in Trovatore, and in Rigoletto, for an example, a crucial part of the last act plays out in the half hour between 11:30 and midnight, a period which is bookended by the sound of a striking clock. But in Falstaff, Verdi takes this a stage further, accompanying the 12 strokes of the Windsor clock with a series of chords which only reach their final resolution after the 12th stroke. So we start here, for the harmonically minded among you, and we go on this little journey. And we arrive back where we started, harmonically. F major, if you're interested in these things. In an opera that otherwise tends to hurtle forwards, both in its music and storytelling. This is actually, I'll play it for you as it appears in the opera in a moment, but it's a surprisingly still, meditative moment. It's almost as if the aging Verdi is inviting us just for 1 minute to sit and experience that precious commodity real time. Now, I speeded up those chords so that you could get an idea of the arc of the journey, but this is the way it works in the thing. And interestingly, for me, it's almost a purely musical effect. You do hear Falstaff counting the strokes across the top, but all simply on one note, on the same note as the bell, and otherwise it's essentially a non-verbal event. It's about music, it's about time. That was a moment very much admired by Benjamin Britten, interestingly. He kind of singled that out as an example of Verdi's genius, that moment. As I said, it's a very untypical moment in the piece, which spends much of its length, at least before that last act, kind of hurtling relentlessly through the plot. And in fact, that fast pace was an aspect that alienated some early audiences who were used to the much more expansive and leisurely forms of a traditional Italian numbers opera, with its clear division into recitative, aria, ensemble, chorus, etc. In Falstaff, more than once, a character will often start a promising piece of aria-worthy material, only to break it off when waylaid by a new event, a new thought, or a new emotion. For example, when Ford visits Falstaff in the guise of Mr. Brooke, he sings a song about the lovely Alice on this melody. Etc. Seem to have acquired a bit of vibrato on here, but never mind. Now, those of you who already know Falstaff will notice I cheated there, because actually only the first 4 bars of that music were by Verdi. The rest was an extrapolation of his material, a suggestion of how another, more conventional, and I might add less talented composer, might have started to build a longer musical structure, a song or an aria on those foundations. What actually happens in the opera is different. And it relates very much, I think, to the psychology of the moment. Ford, although presenting a false identity to Falstaff, is actually singing about his own real-life wife, Alice. And he already has doubts about her faithfulness. So Mr. Brooke's fictional feelings are, to a certain extent, Ford's own real ones. And we can hear them bubbling up and sabotaging the musical flow. So this is what actually happens in that scene. In Windsor there's a lady, ah, she is so enchanting. Her name is Alice, her husband a certain Ford. I love her, she doesn't love me. I write to her, she won't answer. I watch her, she ignores me. Pursue her, and she avoids me. I've squandered half my fortune. So what starts off in a sense, as the start of a kind of 5-minute song, disintegrates after 4 bars into a sequence of much more fragmentary events. So Verdi, of course, is reflecting the disjointed, fragmentic, chaotic way in which our minds sometimes work, particularly under pressure. But I think he's also playing with our expectations of musical time. Ford sets out on what we think will be a longer musical journey, but it never happens. Later in the piece, there's a moment where we are cut adrift from any idea at all, I feel, of ordered, calibrated time. This is in Falstaff's monologue at the start of Act 3, whose text we visited a few minutes ago. Let me see if I can find it. What have I done with my clicker? Yes, this is this moment that we talked about. I'll just sing you a little bit of how Verdi sets that to music. Mondo reo, non c'è più virtù. Tutto declina. So for me, those orchestral phrases, the phrases that punctuate his singing, are Falstaff staring into the void. In the context of 19th century Italian opera, they're almost not music at all. There's no harmony, and in a sense, there's no rhythm either. If one simply heard that first phrase, without seeing it written out in a score or seeing a conductor marking the beats, it would be very hard, even for a skilled musician, to work out exactly what the notated rhythm was. Now, in fact, if you're interested, it looks like this. And looking at that, I was reminded of a phrase from another work, premiered just 11 years before Falstaff. Parsifal, of course, is a wildly different work, definitely not a comedy. And where Falstaff deals only obliquely with the nature of time, Parsifal grapples with it head-on. If you know it, you may remember at one point Gurnemanz uses the almost Einstein-esque phrase "Zum Raum wird hier die Zeit." Here time becomes space. But for all their differences, here we see two composers just a decade apart doing something very similar, creating an unaccompanied, unharmonized phrase with a free-floating rhythm that makes us feel that time itself has been suspended. Just to remind you how Parsifal starts, this is it. So interestingly, again, if you didn't have a score in front of you and you couldn't see a conductor, which of course you wouldn't have been able to Bayreuth, if you know Bayreuth, because you can't see the conductor, I think you would have great difficulty identifying the rhythm of that phrase, where the beats fall. Now, I'm not necessarily suggesting a direct influence here, though Verdi did own a score of Parsifal. I just find it interesting that the two giants of 19th century opera should find themselves exploring such similar territory in their final works, because Parsifal was Wagner's final work as well. For my last example from Falstaff, I'd like to go back to the very beginning of the piece, in fact, to its very first chord, because it combines two of the things I've been talking about, that confounding of expectations and a deliberate ambiguity around rhythm. So the very first sound we hear is a strong C major chord. Nothing unusual about that, one might think, particularly at the start of a comic opera. I mean, the two that occur to me, così fan tutte. We start like that. And actually, while we're on Wagner, the Meistersinger. So when Falstaff starts up, we perceive its first C major chord, for a split second at least, as being on the downbeat, the first strong beat of the bar, rather the strong first beat of the bar, like those first chords in Così and Meistersinger. But as the music continues, we realize that something is slightly skewed. So that C major chord turns out not to have been on the downbeat, but on the traditionally weak second beat of the bar. And again, unless we see the conductor at the start, we don't immediately realize that the first beat of the opera is a silence. Incidentally, another parallel with Parsifal. The very first beat of Parsifal that I showed you a moment ago is also a silence. So the effect of those opening bars has been compared to a drunken man trying to regain his balance. I would say it's also Verdi setting out his stall right from the very first bar, giving us a glimpse of some of the musical games he'll be playing throughout the piece. Although Verdi and Boito tried to keep the Falstaff project a secret as they worked on it, news inevitably leaked out, and Verdi found himself replying to journalists' questions. His response, reiterated many times, was that he was writing entirely for his own pleasure, not thinking of theatres or audiences. To a certain extent, I think this was just careful PR, an exercise in expectation management, an insurance policy in case the project was never completed or turned out to be a failure. And in reality, the going was not always smooth. At various points, Verdi sank into depression and stopped composing, usually because of external events, such as the deaths of friends. But looking back at Falstaff now, that statement doesn't feel so far off the mark. There is a sense that the aged Verdi, with nothing to prove and nothing to lose, really was relishing his freedom to experiment, to ignore conventions, to confound expectations. And when the creative juices were flowing, his letters were full of an almost mischievous glee. I'm amusing myself by writing fugues. Yes, sir, a fugue, and a comic fugue, which would be in place in Falstaff. You will say, but how do you mean a comic fugue? Why comic? I don't know how or why, but it's a comic fugue. Also, when Verdi said that he wasn't concerned with audiences or theatres, perhaps he was just being prescient. Although the Falstaff premiere in 1893 was a huge cultural and social event, the opera itself struggled to gain a foothold in the international repertoire. Verdi's earlier operas, such as Rigoletto, La Traviata, and Aida, remained significantly more popular. Only in the mid-20th century, really, did Falstaff gradually start climbing up the list of most performed operas. Perhaps it's a tribute to Verdi's doggedness, brilliance, and far-sightedness that for us audiences now, in the 21st century, the fugue, which ended up as the finale of Falstaff, no longer seems a curiosity or an anomaly in a comic opera, but something entirely natural, entirely satisfying, the only possible conclusion. And those other musical games, the tricks of timing, the missed beats, the musical ducking and weaving, just seem like the natural clothing of a great comedy. Perhaps he was writing it just to amuse himself, but go to a performance of Falstaff now, 140 years on, listen to the audience laughing, and I think you'll agree that Verdi's smile is now on our faces too. Thank you very much.